Raney, congratulations on receiving the Stephen Hamblett First Amendment Award. It's well deserved.
Thank you. I'm a little bit overwhelmed. I didn't know you were going to have so many incredible people speaking about me. I just have to take a moment to say thank you again. That was amazing.
So, Raney, I wanted to pick up on the question that your children were asking you at the dinner table. Are your journalists safe in Ukraine? You know, the Committee to Protect Journalists reports that 7 journalists have been killed in Ukraine this year. So can you talk about the courage the reporters are showing in reporting on the invasion and how you can try to ensure their safety?
Well, I'll start with the last part of your question first. I mean, I would say that everybody running news organizations today, and you heard AC Thompson talk about it even, has to think about safety constantly. So it's not just in Ukraine, it's also in the United States. He spoke about doxing and the pressures he's facing now with white supremacists. And I think that the key difference is that people who now are operating in Ukraine have to go in with the most serious security that's possible. So Frontline is a very small team right now that's in Ukraine. I'm fortunate to work at GBH and with PBS, and both institutions really believe in resourcing us in security terms. CPB does as well. So we have the resources to send our teams in with the right security. That said, they're operating in a war zone. It's always something that we offer as an option. We never force. And we spend a lot of time talking about scenarios in which, things can go wrong. And as you said, 7 journalists have been killed. There's a lot of journalists operating in Ukraine and around the world right now. And it's a very serious time right now. We have a great security team that does risk assessments for us. And I'm very involved as well. So is our senior staff. So all of us think about this, day and night. And so that's why my kids know about it, because, Ukraine is a number of hours ahead, of course. And oftentimes in the middle of the night, we'll be hearing things.
I was also struck by the threats that Frontline and ProPublica reporter AC Thompson talked about. What are some of the dangers that reporters are facing here in the United States, and what can be done about that?
Yeah, I would say it's a great question. I would say that starting about 5 or 6 years ago, we started to consider domestic reporting as serious as we did international reporting in security terms. So if you were attending rallies, if you were reporting on white supremacy, if you were reporting on anti-Semitism, racism, all of these issues, we considered that high risk. And what AC Thompson has been doing, of course, is reporting on, starting with Charlottesville, really documenting the rise of hate in the United States of America. As he mentioned, it's really his story to tell. His story is one that, his family has been attacked, his livelihood, and that's because he's doing investigative journalism in the public interest. We're identifying people at rallies that perhaps didn't want to be. That is, something that we need to do. We need to document. We're people who need to hold the record here. It also means that journalists who do that type of reporting are taking on extra risk. And I would say everyone in journalism right now feels that way. It's not necessarily just in the area of doing that specific reporting, but reporting in general right now is something that we just have to think through every single time we're out in the field now.
World Press Freedom Day is coming up on May 3rd, and Reporters Without Borders will again provide a map showing where press freedom stands around the globe. So can you give us, provide your perspective on how free the press is around the world right now?
I mean, I would say we're all very concerned. We did a really important film called 1,000 Cuts with Maria Reza, featuring Maria Reza's work in the Philippines. Of course, we all know her now as the Nobel Prize winner. What the real truth of the matter is, the company that she founded, the journalists in the Philippines, they increasingly saw the freedom of the press restricted there in the Duterte era and continue to see restrictions today. You see restrictions in Hungary. You see them all across the planet right now. And to some degree, what I think Frontline's job is right now is to document that as well. And importantly, to work with international journalists. So one of the most powerful tools that we have right now is to actually work with international journalists in a way that we never have before. So we have a big project around the Pegasus Project, which is really an important international collaboration. But increasingly, we're finding ourselves reaching across to people who are working, investigative reporters in Mexico, and places where it's really difficult. It's more difficult than working here. And we're trying to amplify their work. Going back to the Philippines, one of the things that we experienced with 1,000 Cuts, that film, was they simply couldn't get distribution for that documentary in the Philippines. So what did Frontline do? I just had this idea. It was a late night idea that maybe what we should do is actually distribute it ourselves on YouTube in the Philippines. So we did. And you cannot believe the hundreds of thousands of people who watched 1,000 Cuts in the Philippines because they had access to that. So that is powerful, right? If you think about it. Their own press can't show that, right? Rappler, the group that Maria Reza founded, does, but it's a really, really important way of saying we need to think creatively about how do you get factual journalism, not just here in America, but internationally now. So our scope is much larger than it was just a number of years ago because of these restrictions across the globe.
You've talked about how a mentor once told you corruption doesn't show its face. But at the same time, there are fewer and fewer journalists out there holding people in power accountable. So what happens when newspapers shut down and communities end up in news deserts? What fills that void?
Well, thank you for doing your homework, first of all. That was one of the most clarifying moments for me when one of my mentors said that. And I thought, that's the purpose. That's why I'm on the planet. Like, pure and simple. I'm a mother and I'm a journalist. And actually, that is the concept that I hold near and dear, which is that, if you don't have journalists and communities, then what do we know what's really happening? So we all know what's happening to local journalism. In fact, I was on the Knight Commission with the Aspen Institute looking at that very issue. And again, what I walked away with is something very important. When local journalism is decimated, as we see now, does not have a business model, trust in journalism breaks down across the whole spectrum of journalism. It's not just national and local anymore. It's just this idea of journalism. There's a lack of trust in it, right? We don't know a fact from a fact. It's very difficult right now for people to decipher what is really the truth. And one of the things that is a big breakdown in America and can really hurt our democracy is this problem at the local level. So I'm hyper-focused right now on local. In fact, we received a really generous grant from CPB and also the Knight Foundation to start funding local journalists. Again, with this idea towards we want to be part of the solution. We're not the only solution, but we're now working with 5 local newsrooms. And some of our most profound journalism now is coming out of these local newsrooms that we're supporting financially and editorially. And we're collaborating with them, and then we're sharing their stories. But I would say it's something we all need to pay attention to, and you all are doing that, Yeah,
you mentioned you were a member of the Knight Commission on Trust, Media, and Democracy, and one of the recommendations in that report called for journalists to practice radical transparency.
Yeah.
So tell us about what that means and what Frontline did in that regard.
Well, it's an interesting story. So Mizell Stewart and I were the folks who came up with that terminology, and the idea was, so to build trust, how do you build trust? One thing is to not assume that you have it in the first place. And I think that's very hard for legacy media to actually think about the fact that not everyone trusts what they say, and to think instead about how can you build trust. So at the center of radical transparency, and why we use that terminology, was to think out of the box about how you might start to build trust. So Frontline, what we do, and every news organization is different, is we do something pretty radical. And the journalists in the room and the lawyers all know why this is so different. We actually open up our long form interviews. So not just what you see in the film, not what's been edited, but actually the real conversation that occurred. The thinking behind this, right, was that if we could show you the edits, if we could show you the actual conversation, then you watch the documentary, right? You would be able to say, you can judge for yourself. Were we fair? Were we tough enough? And that was the idea behind this big transparency project that we launched, actually with Putin's Revenge, which is a big film a number of years ago, where we said, well, if there's any territory we need to be transparent about, it would be on Russia and Putin. And we were right? So we started to publish this, I have to say, because I'm hoping Dale Cohen's listening in. Dale Cohen is our special counsel. You cannot do this work without copious work from lawyers and also from our editors like Andrew Metzler and Azell. These folks are reading everything before we publish this. So it's seen as an act of publishing. And why I say that is because, you can't just release a conversation if there are factual errors, right? You can't release it if somebody's libeling someone, right? So you have to be very careful, even in the landscape of, so-called radical transparency, to make sure that you consider this an act of publishing. And this is really what we do. It's been great. I would say one of the things that is counterintuitive is that we did this really as a trust building exercise with, we thought would be a smaller audience. In fact, people love these interviews. They watch them. They watch them on average for 20, 25 minutes. Sometimes we see millions of views for these interviews. That isn't just really not expected. And it's a thrill to see people coming under this tent and saying, hey, I want to see what this is. I want to understand journalism and the actual conversation. It's really, really inspiring to see the audience.
That commission also said that all Americans must possess civic and media literacy. So What are some concrete things? Do you talk about that with your kids? What are some concrete things to do to become more media literate?
So I definitely think it starts in the home. I really do. I know that that's not realistic in some cases, but I do think having a conversation with your children about the media that they are watching is really important. I've often said, and I see this with my own children and other people's children, that if you think about it, the youth of today are having the first unmitigated experience with media. They are watching what they want to watch. They have full access to the world. And we're not with them as they're watching. If you think about our media consumption as grownups, our parents were there. I had very little, in fact, myself, but I'm saying, like, even if I had, my father would be there, my mother would be there. There would be somebody there to talk to me. And in fact, I can remember those conversations. What our children now have with their iPhones and access to the internet is their own experience that they don't know how to differentiate. So a lot of work that we do at Frontline is taking what we do. And I know this sounds, it sounds a little bit boring, but it's really important. But we take our work and we work with our PBS Learning Media folks, and we actually break it down for people in the middle school and high school. So teachers use our journalism and teach it. And I'm hoping, and I see this happening in our school, but not all across America, conversations about media literacy, trusted sources. Where do you get your news from? These conversations are starting to happen, but it's not too late, but it's certainly, we've been slow at the wheel here. We need to get going with this part of the conversation, I think.
You also talked about the value of WGBH and PBS. So can you give us the state of public media in this country? And can you address what's going on over in Britain with attempts to cut the funding for the BBC?
Yeah, I mean, the BBC, I can't really comment on other than to say that it is, from our perspective, we work with the BBC a lot. We see value in their journalism, their clear eyes, and their fair and really serious journalism. So we're concerned about what's happening there. Public media right now in the United States is decently funded. Our funding is, I wouldn't say secure, but it's steady. I would say that the thing that we have as a strength in the public television side is our stations. We have 330 stations across America that continue to contribute to what we call the National Programming Service. So that is shows like Frontline. It's also shows like Nova, the incredible show about science, right? It's American Experience, the history show. It's all the big shows. So the stations support us to do our work through PBS, right? bit of a complex system, but it works. The other big benefit for public media is it's non-commercial, right? So Frontline, for example, is in front of all paywalls. This is really important to access, right? So we not only are we in people's living rooms on television, but we're also streaming. So one of the really big benefits to something like the landscape we're in today, from my perspective, is millions of young people see Frontline on YouTube, on PBS's streaming platform. So it's not relegated only to the broadcast, right? It's beyond broadcast now. And you would be surprised. The numbers on YouTube of younger people in their 20s and 30s watching us are amazing and extraordinary. And they have conversations about the content. They watch for over 20 minutes on average. This is really encouraging about, younger people who are hungry for fact-based journalism. I just have to say, I've been really optimistic seeing what's happening now in a streaming environment.
That's great to hear. You mentioned the skepticism, people suspicious of the press. It's such a polarized political atmosphere. And you're presenting objective investigative journalism. How do you handle coverage of hot topics like, you took on the spread of the belief that the 2020 presidential election was rigged?
So that's a great question. We're just professional journalists and editors. This is the best way to answer it. We have a process that is journalistic. And what we do is we vet every single thing and every, for example, you mentioned the plot to overturn the election. We were able to, with ProPublica, to identify a small group of people who actually had a plot to overturn the election. We had documentation. We had not just interviews, but we had backup interviews. We had multiple sources, and we go through a process where, the truth of the matter is we only say what we know. We don't go even an iota farther. And that is our process. And you heard people talk about, I'm so tough. Well, I'm tough on the facts, and that's one thing I am tough about. I may be very nice, but, it's almost like my belief in science. It's like, you have to believe in processes, and you have to believe that there's a way to get through difficult territory with facts and with vision, and not be swayed by either side, but to think hard about what we can really say at Frontline. So we're investigative. I think there's a benefit to that. I think if I was running like a breaking news outfit and you had to bounce between people's point of view without thought, that might be very difficult. But we have the benefit of time. So that's something that I'm going to always protect at Frontline, is time to make good decisions. We all know that, right? That if you take a little more time and you think more thoughtfully, you come to a better decision. So this is what we do at Frontline day in and day out. The editors at Frontline are tireless. We have a fact checker. You never want her to fact check you. Trust me. She knows everything. She is an inspiration. This is Kate Weiwert. She is truly, and Lauren and Andrew and Dale know this, she is really an outrageously good fact checker. And she just cares deeply about us getting it right. And we emphasize at Frontline that that's the most important thing we do. So cinematography, yes. Storytelling, yes. I love that. I'm a filmmaker, but it's actually journalism and facts. And that's what we're about.
You talked about being a cub reporter in Taiwan. So I wanted to ask you what advice you would give to young reporters and to the journalism students listening tonight. Yeah. What do you know now about journalism that you wish you knew at the University of Wisconsin?
Oh, nothing more, actually. I just love the field, right? So I just love the challenge of it. Every single day, I'm approaching it with fresh eyes and with the feeling that we have to get it right and do better. Every single day, every hour of my life is all about that. And I would just say, as a younger journalist, there are a couple of things I did right. And it was as simple as practicing journalism, leaving my apartment, going places, seeing the world, being a journalist in the world, going to Taiwan. I didn't know I was going to experience a democracy unfold. And that's what I got to witness as a young person with my own eyes. I wasn't reading about it. I wasn't on the phone. I was in the streets covering it. And that is my biggest piece of advice. Get out of your apartments. I know it's hard. COVID was pretty challenging. So I don't mean get out if it's dangerous. When it's safe and you can do it in a secure way, try to go and practice journalism and in all the forms that you hope to do. So I was a writer back then. I became a filmmaker, but if you can pick up your camera, pick up a camera, pick up your pencil, but make sure that you take notes. That's one thing that I was never really good at, is taking notes. So that's why filmmaking was was a terrific medium for me, because I was filming it, because I was never the best note taker. So I think, see where your strengths are and go in that direction and what you love to do.
And when you're hiring new reporters, what are the qualities or the skills that you're looking for?
I mean, the first thing I'm looking for is curiosity. I want people who are actually curious and don't think they have it all figured out. To this day, I know I don't, about literally anything. And that's why we're still good at what we do. We are curious every day. Did we get it right? Are we thinking hard enough? Did we think about the so-called other side? Are there facts that we haven't thought about before? Is there new information that we haven't found? So someone who's naturally curious, you can just tell those types of people. The second thing is fairness. Is a person fair? This is really important to me at Frontline. Are you thinking in a fair way? Again, that comes down to this idea of being open-minded enough that you might be wrong, and report against your assumptions, report against yourself until the bitter end. Before you publish, you better know every argument against what you're trying to make, or you could be wrong. So that's what I like in a person. Skill sets, it's great when younger journalists have data skills. I really love people who know how to, have those investigative skills now that can help us amplify the work beyond the character. And that's something that we look for.
One of our listeners says they're really interested in reporting on war. So the question is, what and how can we go towards that? How can we go towards that direction when we're not present on the ground?
Yeah, that's very difficult. I would say that that's a great question, and one that's hard to answer at the current stage, especially as dangerous it is in a place like Ukraine. We're tending to use people who have prior wartime experience. But I will say there's a couple of younger people on our team who don't. And what we've done with them is, and this is what happened to me in my career, is in my 20s, when I was working for ABC News, I was not sent to a war zone. I really wanted to go, but I was put in charge of other elements of the reporting, and it sounds very mundane, all the production managing, all of the organizing of travel and keeping people safe. I learned those skills in my mid-20s. And when my boss said, I'm sorry, I'm not sending you to Kosovo, I'm not sending you to these places, I said, that's okay. What can I do? And that's my best piece of advice. Ask that question, what can I do? And the closer you get to this work, the closer you'll be to being sent. And you will get sent if you keep at it. That's really my best advice.
And another listener wanted you to talk about some of the ethical dilemmas you face while reporting on war and the discussion you have in the newsroom for those dilemmas.
I mean, there's dilemmas all day long. One of the biggest dilemmas we have had was last year when we were doing a big film out of Afghanistan. We started filming before the United States had pulled out. And we had a series of interviews with women who were talking very openly about their situation in Afghanistan. When the US pulled out, and we hadn't aired our film yet, and the United States, as we all know, pulled out, and conversations were starting to be had about the Taliban, what their approach may be towards women's rights. We went back to those women and said, are you comfortable with your faces being on camera still? Because it's a different regime now. How do you feel? And we didn't just go with the prior consents, right? Legally speaking, we were covered, but we all decided at Frontline we had to go back to every single individual who had spoken to us, because it had been a huge change. Most of the people decided to continue to want to speak out, but in a couple of very important cases, people took, a different approach and just asked politely, please blur my face and disguise my voice. And we respected their choice. And that's something that we think about all the time. When you're putting people on camera, think hard about who they are, what risks they're taking. Make sure you have informed consent. Really, really important. And we'll never get it totally right, but you hope that you get it right, again, with that thoughtful process around it.
One question is, what's your message to news managers more concerned with their financial bottom lines, fearful of lawsuits from the subjects of investigative pieces than they are about exposing illegalities?
Well, my first piece of advice is to hire an amazing lawyer, like actually work with you all and figure out what actual intellectual talent you need at your side to publish investigative journalism. So I do believe that filmmakers and news organizations that do not have sophisticated legal help and editors should be careful with publishing, right? It is such a litigious environment now. So Frontline is blessed with the resources to do that. However, I knew that I needed them as a news leader, right? So I knew I needed someone with, Dale Cohen's experience and knowledge and expertise. I just knew that. And so we hired him. So I would say your first piece is like, look around at your leadership. Is there someone there who understands the First Amendment, understands libel, understands all of these issues that we face today in a new environment, right? As publishers and people who are journalists. If you don't, maybe that's where you start. You suggest, how do you build a small team? And it could be very small at first and very righteous, right? And then you can build out from there. But we really take this issue very seriously. In fact, Dale, and a lot of the work he does now at UCLA is training filmmakers who don't have this background, don't understand the law. I had the benefit of going to Columbia, where I studied the First Amendment with some of the best, legal scholars. So it's in me as a leader, but a lot of people don't have that training. And you need that if you're going to do this type of work.
And what would you say to the aspiring young journalists at Roger Williams University and all these other colleges around New England that are tuned in about why they should go into journalism? Why should they choose this profession?
Okay, so that's a great question. I mean, I can just say with my perspective, now being, a couple of decades in, it's a really gratifying career. I feel like I'm doing something that's meaningful, that's giving voice to people that don't have voices. I'd say it's very hard work. The other thing I do say is, and this is not to be discouraging, but it's more to just be real. If you don't love this work, consider other work that's meaningful. And I talk a lot with my kids, not about like what makes you happy, but more about what do you find meaning from. And actually, those were conversations I had with my father, when I was young. What gives you meaning? And my mom too. It's like, what is going to give you personal meaning? And journalism for me was the answer, right? And for some people, it's being a teacher, a doctor, a leader in another industry. But, if you love journalism, start practicing it. Make sure you love it, and then just keep going, and you'll find your way.
Excellent way to end it. Raney, Aronson-Rath, thank you for talking to us tonight, and congratulations.
All right. Thank you so much.